Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I am your host for another episode of our research series from the Faculty of Sport. My name is Dr. Olivia Rose, sports psychologist at the Mona Academy. And today we have with us Dr. Aldeam Facey, who will be sharing a very exciting and informative research that he's conducted. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Dr. Facey and who he is and what he will be presenting on. So Dr. Aldeam Facey is a lecturer at the University of the West Indies, Mona campus, and has been involved in quantitative research for over 10 years. He has a PhD in biochemistry, and his research has focused on the parameters of performance improvement in Jamaican athletes. He has published many articles, abstracts, and presented his studies at international conferences. He currently serves as the head of academic programs and activities at the Mona Academy of Sport. In his spare time, Dr. Facey is good at the mind games. He loves playing chess and he also plays badminton. In keeping again with our research mandate to ensure sport and its practices in Jamaica are research driven, the Faculty of Sport has our research seminar series of which you are now a part of. And today, our presenter, Dr. Aldeam Facey, will be presenting on the topic assessing serum biochemical parameters in Jamaican athletes. Dr. Facey, over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rose, for the lovely introduction. I do hope that you guys will find the presentation interesting. I surely find it interesting, and I will try to break down all the jargons and the references made in as simple terms as possible, so that you can find something relatable or useful from the presentation. All right, so let's get right into it. All right, so as indicated just now, the title for the presentation is the Serum Biochemical Profile of Jamaican Athletes. And what we'll be looking at essentially is a snapshot of a fit, ready for competition athlete from a biochemical perspective. Now, for monitoring and improving an athlete's performance, there are several angles and factors that sport personnel need to take into consideration. So we have the biomechanical techniques, which the coaches are supposed to be able to guide the athletes accordingly so that they can improve from that aspect. The psychological factors, and we have, of course, Dr. Rhodes here, who would be heavily involved in that. So the zoning and the imaging, getting the athlete ready mentally, is an important factor to increase performance. The recovery techniques, if an athlete is able to recover quickly following intense training, then they will be able to perform better when it's time for competition. More training can be done, etc. Nutritional factors, and this is one that is often overlooked, and athletes tend to supplement their diets. This is not necessary, and it is not advised, especially by WADA, given that, oftentimes these supplements may be contaminated with banned substances. So that's another area that we are looking very closely at, investigating here at the Faculty of Sport. And finally, we're going to be talking about the physiological factors, and this is the area where very little attention has been placed, especially here in the Caribbean, in Jamaica. Very little emphasis has been placed on the physiological factors that may impact the athlete's performance, or the factors that we may be able to use to indicate levels of fitness of athletes prior to competition. So when we talk about physiological factors, there are several angles that we can take, right? And there are a lot of biochemical parameters that we can incorporate in this one small category. But today we'll be looking at a few. And the first one is creatinine kinase. So we'll be looking at a few enzymes, and don't be alarmed by the names of these enzymes. They're pretty simple, and the function is quite simple as well. So the enzyme creatinine kinase is a key enzyme in energy metabolism. It catalyzes the reversible phosphorylation of creatine in the presence of ATP and hydrogen ions. Now, before I go any further, I just want to paint a picture for you when it comes to energy metabolism in athletes. So there are three primary systems that we look at when we talk about energy metabolism in athletes. There's the glycolytic pathway, we have the creatine phosphate pathway, and we also have mitochondrial respiration, which is the oxidative phosphorylation which occurs in the mitochondria following the Krebs cycle, the TCA cycle, and that's aerobic respiration. We're not going to be focusing so much on that aspect today. We're going to be looking at the energy pathways that are very important when it comes to especially explosive power. The creatine kinase enzyme is a critical enzyme when considering the creatine phosphate pathway. So the research literature has indicated that the creatine kinase levels are higher in physically active individuals. So we are expecting that these levels should be higher in athletes, and we're going to be able to quantify those levels in Jamaican athletes as well. Now, an important consideration when looking at this enzyme, creatine kinase, is that there are genetic factors that influence the levels in the bloodstream. And here you can see we already have an inclusion criteria, or should I say an exclusion criteria, given that the creatine kinase enzyme is race dependent. So it's higher in Black people and compared to persons of European descent. Now, could this be a factor influencing the better performance that we see in athletes of African descent when it comes to track and field, especially? It could be a factor. We'll investigate further shortly. So, when we talk about the creatine kinase enzyme, this is how it performs its action. There's creatine, which through the addition of an ATP molecule produces creatine phosphate, or this phosphocreatine molecule here. Now, why is this important? So in the bloodstream or in the muscles, you will have approximately 8 millimoles per kilogram of wet weight of ATP readily available to provide energy. Now, this immediately disappears once you start an intense exercise. The, the phosphocreatine that is formed here is a store for ATP molecules. And in the muscles, you may have approximately 26 millimoles per kilogram of wet weight readily available to provide energy for the first 5 to 6 seconds of an intense exercise. So right there, you think about the 100-meter race, it is primarily fueled by creatine phosphate. So that is why this enzyme here is really important. Now, the second enzyme that we're going to be looking at is lactate dehydrogenase. So when we talk about the glycolytic pathway, the glycolytic pathway can lead to the mitochondrial respiration through the metabolism of pyruvate, but it can also lead to the metabolism of pyruvate to lactate, which is an anaerobic pathway. The anaerobic pathway utilizes the enzyme lactate dehydrogenase to convert pyruvate to lactate, producing more ATP molecules, and it does so in the absence of oxygen. So while the mitochondrial respiration needs oxygen, this pathway doesn't need oxygen. So for intense physical activity, the lactate pathway is used increasingly up to a point. So for example, the 400-meter race, once you have depleted the creatine phosphate, you're dependent on the lactate pathway. And 400-meter runners can tell you that it really burns after a 400-meter race. And this is as a result of the production of lactate, which burns the muscles. Lactate is the same as lactic acid. Some athletes or coaches will refer to it as lactic acid. The more appropriate term is lactate, given that acids dissociate in the bloodstream. All right, so the conversion of pyruvate to lactate and vice versa is governed by the enzyme LDH. But there's an important point that we also need to highlight here, and that's elevated serum LDH and CK creatine kinase can indicate muscle damage. So, how can we do an investigation taking a snapshot of an athlete's biochemical profile when these enzymes are also associated with muscle damage or injuries? Well, we have another exclusion criteria here. We cannot use athletes who are injured, right? So we talked about creatine kinase, we talked about lactate dehydrogenase, and finally, basal lactate. So it's very difficult to talk about lactate dehydrogenase without mentioning basal lactate. The levels that we're going to talk about and measure in this study is not necessarily the serum sample. The concentration would be comparable, but we're talking about fingerprint lactate here. So, given the involvement of creatine kinase and lactate dehydrogenase in energy metabolism, we hypothesize that the activities of these enzymes will be associated in some way with basal lactate concentration. And we talk about basal lactate, we're talking about fasting, rested lactate levels. At any point in time in the bloodstream, you have some amount of lactate. You don't have to be running, but the basal lactate levels in another part of this study looked at how that could be an indicator of fitness. So we're going to mention that as well. All right, so what did we do? So for this study, we got ethical approval from the UA Ethics Committee. I consulted a biostatistician who calculated the quantity of participants that would be needed for the study. And we exceeded the quantity that was suggested based on the calculations they made. And we used a total of approximately 69 athletes and controls for the study. So we had 23 male athletes, 10 female athletes, and 19 and 17 male and female controls, respectively. So that was the study participants. I must mention that we had to distinguish between the athletes and the controls using the modified version of the fitness questionnaire. So there's a fitness questionnaire American College of Sports Medicine publishes. We modify that version of the questionnaire, and that is what we use to distinguish between athletes and controls. But athletes had to be currently and consistently training with a certified coach in order for them to qualify. Also, we did not use athletes who just started their training. The athletes who were used are competition ready. Most of them were doing their time trials and getting ready for competition. The controls, however, are individuals who do not participate in any physical activity, less than 20 minutes per week, but they are healthy and they are age and BMI matched with the respective athletes. So the primary difference that we're trying to highlight here is levels of fitness. So very fit individuals currently and consistently training, and we have healthy individuals, BMI and age matched, who are not training. Right? So the inclusion criteria that we mentioned, we're able to distinguish between the groups using the modified version of the American College of Sports Medicine fitness questionnaire. And by modification, we simply added questions, more questions that were more specific to the study, aiding in distinguishing the group and ensuring that the participants are, as far as we could determine, healthy. The participants fasted overnight, and immediately after the fast, At the start of the study, we collected the basal lactate concentration using the lactate plus um, uh, measuring tool. So that was just a finger prick, just like you would use to measure glucose concentration in patients living with type 2 diabetes. The machine looks the same, but it just detects another variable, which is basal lactate. We collected serum samples or blood samples using venipuncture. We allowed the sample to stand for about 25 minutes. We centrifuged the sample and we extracted the serum from the blood sample. We placed them in microcentrifuge tubes and continued our testing. We did several tests on these serum samples, but again, we're only going to be discussing the two primary enzymes that are directly related to energy metabolism. In subsequent presentations, we can discuss further other variables. All right, so how do we analyze the data? Once we had received the data, we use Pearson's bivariate correlation to form relationships, and we use the two-tailed test, two-tailed t-test, and the levels of significance were noted at the p 0.05 level, and the data is reported as mean and standard deviation. Throughout the display of results, you'll notice that both CK and LDH are listed together. We did not do an over analysis, right? And we only had two groups of athletes and controls. And we had two variables in this section of the research. All right, we mentioned this already, but just to highlight further how the samples were tested, we used the Cobas 6000 auto analyzer, and that was able to quickly get these tests done. All right, so let's move on to some of the results. So here are the participants that we're working with. We're looking at age and BMI matched controls, right? And look at the average age and the standard deviation. We did some anthropometric tests, look at some anthropometrical characteristics. We assessed body fat percentage using the ultrasound technology. We measured pulse readings as well, and these were only for comparison. We did not expect to find significant differences between the groups. That was our primary aim in using healthy age and BMI matched controls. So that's for the males, and here we have the differences in the females, age and BMI matched controls, and other anthropometrical characteristics. All right. So here are the exciting results that I would like to discuss. So we're looking at units per liter of lactate dehydrogenase and creatine kinase, otherwise called creatine phosphokinase, same thing. So in both the males and the females, we had significant differences in the creatine kinase activity when compared with the controls. Remember, these were individuals who were not injured, but had significantly higher CK levels when compared to the controls. But something else was interesting here. We had hypothesized that would find significantly higher lactate dehydrogenase levels in the athletes when compared to the controls. We did not find that. There was no significant difference in the lactate dehydrogenase activity when comparing the athletes with the controls. And we have a theory regarding this finding that I'm going to discuss a little later on in the discussion section. But this was completely unexpected, and I wanted to highlight this, that sometimes you're doing your research and you're adamant about finding something, you're expecting to find something, and the results shock you. We didn't find a significant difference. The significant difference that we found was related to the CK activity. Another aspect of this study that I want to highlight is that while basal lactate did not have a significant association with the lactate dehydrogenase levels, and again, this is basal lactate, so no physical activity, no intense physical activity. This is after a fast. The relationship between the basal lactate and the lactate dehydrogenase doesn't exist in this case. Maybe during activity, it should be, but not in this case. We, however, found that basal lactate was significantly correlated with adiposity. And this relationship led us to do further tests. What is it about adiposity that impacts basal lactate levels? And we looked at other adipocytokines and whatnot and found interesting results. So we found a significant correlation here using the Pearson's correlation, and we found a medium effect size with an R squared value of approximately 0.6. And that was the significant finding that we had here when it comes to body fat and lactate. Now, let's discuss some of these findings. So, lactate dehydrogenase is not useful for measuring fitness in athletes. Fine. The important thing that I want to highlight here is that lactate dehydrogenase has been proven to be a critical metabolite that detects levels of injuries in athletes. Again, these athletes were not injured, but based on the theories that we had assumed from the literature, we expected the levels of lactate dehydrogenase to be elevated. However, further investigations led us to articles that looked at the activities of these enzymes, lactate dehydrogenase, and they found that following exercise, they quickly return to the normal levels. So they don't remain elevated. They remain elevated when the athlete has an injury. So while we don't find a significant level of lactate dehydrogenase here to be used as fitness indicators, lactate dehydrogenase can be on the coach's radar to monitor the levels of injuries in an athlete. And again, this is fasting rested lactate dehydrogenase levels. Creatine kinase, however, is very useful for fitness assessment. So quantifying the CK levels in your specific group of athletes will allow you to monitor their detrained state, and you can use this variable to predict when the athlete is ready for competition based on their energy or expected energy metabolism. And finally, fat has a significant positive relationship with lactate concentration. And for this reason, we had to dive a little bit deeper into adipocytokines to find variables that may impact the lactate concentration, which we may discuss in further presentations. Conclusion: basal lactate concentration has been found to primarily depend on body fat percentage. Adipocytic contribution to basal blood lactate is a reliable assessment tool in athletes and control, as it is independent of serum, CK, and LDH. And finally, LDH may be more useful in monitoring injuries, as indicated just now. So while we didn't find the relationship that we expected with LDH, it still has its potential in assessing athlete injuries. Now, this study was published in the International Journal of Sports Science, and the reference is made there. You can go and check it out and read about it in a lot more detail. And I thank you for listening and invite some questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Facey, for that very informative presentation. And we'd have learned some rather big words and small words that some of us may or may not understand. So I'm just going to open the floor now for questions. Are there any questions for Dr. Facey?
Oh, I'm seeing questions in the chat here.
Okay.
Um,
Hold on. My chat is actually
yes. So the
empty.
important.
Okay, if you are seeing it, that's fine.
Yeah. All right. So when it comes to competition, athletes try to find an advantage, whether it's through training, whether it's through psychological help, whether it's through techniques to improve their performance, whether it's to shave off zero point 0.1 second of their 100-meter time or their 200-meter times. And they tackle this big issue from all angles. Now, we would have used several methods to improve performance here in Jamaica, including coaching. We attempt to provide nutrition for athletes, and some athletes just use supplements to supplement a poor diet. But what was lacking is the physiological aspect, where we're looking at how the athletes metabolize energy and the level of availability of that energy to the athletes. So this research opened our eyes to other aspects of monitoring and improving an athlete's performance, taking into consideration the physiological aspect.
All right, thank you. So you would have answered why this research is important, and we have Connell Lord
Yeah.
who have just asked, can you explain to us what were the key findings in this
All right.
research?
All right. So I'm going to highlight two key findings. So one, we hypothesized that lactate dehydrogenase would be higher in athletes. And a key finding is that that is not the case. Lactate dehydrogenase returns to normal levels within 12 hours prior to competition or training. So it is not a useful tool to detect levels of fitness of an athlete. However, the second finding, creatine kinase, which is one of the enzymes involved in the energy metabolism pathway, is found to be a very useful tool in assessing the level of readiness of an athlete. The CK levels, when an athlete is fully trained, is expected to be high, and we have quantified that at approximately 280 units per mil.
All right, thank you. And
Okay.
oh, continue.
Sorry, I'm seeing another question from.
Yeah, I was gonna ask it.
Oh,
So,
sorry. Go ahead.
Aslet Sharp has asked, who should pay attention to the results of this research?
All right. So, an interesting observation that I made when conducting this study is the impact it had on the coaches. So, with the permission of the athletes, the results of the study were sent to the coaches and to the athletes as well. So they had the anthropometrical profile, body fat percentage, etc. They had the serum profile. We also included lipid profile as well. A lot of variables that are not included in this part. And the more favorable biochemical profiles, based on what we would have theorized, was associated with the top performing athletes. So even before collecting the blood samples, I would have dialogue with the coaches. I could recall a coach from UA at the time, Coach Taylor. It was a long time ago. Taylor's no longer with us. He would tell me the athletes who he expects to perform better. I would go to the time trials and I would observe the athletes performing, and the top performing athletes consistently had better biochemical profiles, including CK.
Right. Thank you.
So,
Well, I
so, so,
think
so to answer the question, yes, coaches are going.
coaches, and I'm seeing Jamie Skeet asking, How does the level of athletes affect the results? That is elite versus non-elite, and I just add into that based on what you just said,
Yeah.
top performing versus those who are not yet top performing.
This is a very interesting question. So, at the time of collecting the data, we used athletes from uh, a very well-known track club, and I don't know if I can say the names of these track clubs. But see, trains at you would know. UA track club, and there's another track club that's not associated with UA that I used. So we used mostly top performing athletes. Of course, in all these clubs, you have athletes who are not performing as well, but they were all pooled in one group, and we looked at the group to compare them with the control group to find levels of enzyme activity that would be able to use to predict levels of fitness. We did not, however, split the groups, top performing athletes, low performing athletes, which is a very good suggestion. The only time we looked at that was discussion with the coaches where we said, hey, we expect these athletes to perform better and these athletes, won't perform as well. And we saw the differences in the biochemical profile. That, however, was not our aim of the study. So we didn't publish any of that data.
Okay, and for future research, what would be an appropriate extension of this?
All right. So an appropriate extension. We did apply for ethical approval, and when an extension of ethical approval with new requests. Um, so we already had approval, and we wanted to continue the study and include other things. One of the things that I wanted to include, and this was also approved, but we didn't get to do this part. The athletes in the study, following the venipuncture, we would have provided a sample of blood, were asked to participate in physical activity, right? So we had a treadmill and they participated in the physical activity where we assessed changes in lactate concentration. That was the primary aim of the study. We did not take another sample after the exercise, which would have showed us how well the enzyme responded to physical activity. So the CK levels, the lactate dehydrogenase levels, etc., after exercise would have provided very valuable information regarding the enzyme activity. So that is a possible extension to this study. But at the time of collecting the data and considering the athletes being involved in competition, because at this time they were peak level athletes, I didn't feel comfortable taking two blood samples. So while they signed consent forms and some were willing, I just wasn't comfortable doing that. So that was the missing piece of the puzzle here.
All right, thank you, and we look forward to that in the future,
Yeah.
especially to see how during the process of rest and recovery, what's needed. All right. Are there any more questions? Let me check the chat again. This is taking a little while to load, so maybe you will be seeing it quicker than I
All right. So
can.
another point while you look for other questions, the the study, yes, it may be filled with jargons, it may be complicated if you're not familiar with the biochemistry, but I try to put it in as simple terms as possible. We're just looking at an enzyme that can indicate the level of fitness of an athlete. So how would this be applicable to a coach who would want to have access to this information? The the use of enzyme analysis would provide an alternate objective perspective to the coaches when considering the athlete's level of fitness. And the challenge here is that it can be a little expensive to get these tests done,
Mm-hmm.
but if coaches work with researchers, they can get a lot of these tests done for free and
Hold on,
use
could
it
you
for,
repeat that
for
part, Dr. Facey, about free?
if you work with researchers, you can get some of these tests done for free, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when collecting data for this study, a lot of the athletes came back for a second assessment, a significant number. They wanted to know how their blood profile would have changed over time. They wanted to know the body fat percentage and the change over time, etc. And they found the information quite useful. So that is something that we were excited
All
to
right. Thank,
to do.
thank you. So was it all right, I see another question in the chat, but I wanted to find
Mhm.
out based on what you just said if it was just the athletes who were interested in this profile or were the coaches also interested?
Yeah, and the coaches. I think I'd mentioned that earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
All
yeah.
right, so I think I saw a question from Cornell Lord who was asking what theoretical approach was used and why.
Okay. So when you ask about theoretical approach that was used, I'm oh, questions are popping up. I'm assuming that you're talking about the um, so this is a quantitative study, and we don't base on theories as you would for qualitative studies. So what we do, we observe and collect data, critically analyze data that would have been published by other authors, and based on the findings of those authors, we create our own hypotheses or assumptions, and then we develop methodology to test those assumptions based on what we would have theorized. So that is how
Okay.
it would work from our context.
All right, so just to add to that question, then, um, were the findings based on the literature and research of previous persons similar or different? So, can you tell us what was similar in our neck of the woods versus what was different?
All right, so what was similar, CK elevated in athletes. Not similar, LDH. We did find findings where authors publish that lactic dehydrogenase is significantly higher in athletes. But what our findings suggest is that one, possibly the time between training and collection of the serum samples for those studies may have been too short for the athlete to recover, or those athletes that they used were injured. So we did
Okay.
not find that elevated lactic dehydrogenase.
All right. Thank you. Are there any other questions? Let me just check again quickly.
Yes, there's
Yes.
another one.
Okay, so we have here at what point in developing an athlete would a coach want to use the results of this analysis?
All right, and this takes me back to another suggestion that I'd made where I indicated that these tests can be expensive, so working with a researcher would help you to get it done for free. Now, for this analysis to be useful, you must do more than one test. So um, you want to track the athlete's progress throughout the training period and see how the CK levels would change over time, right? To get this quick snapshot, we use controls and a group of athletes to find that distinction. But based on the genetic contribution to CK concentration or CK activity, enzyme activity, you need to know the individual resting level. That's before training has initiated. Measure that, record that, watch how it changes over time, watch what the levels are when that athlete has peaked, and that is something that you can have as a snapshot or a profile of that specific athlete. So the next season now, you can use that CK level from the previous years to make a determination of the athlete's level of fitness.
All right, thank you. So, to follow up with that question in terms of at what stage in developing athlete, given the fact that blood samples and so are taken,
Mhm.
um, is there a set age group or would special permission would be required if they were junior athletes versus senior or professional?
Yeah. Yeah, and for this reason, we only use individuals 18 and over for the study so that we could avoid, having to
That
get
part.
consent from the parent and assent form, etc. It can be used for juniors as well, but you have to go through the process of assent, consent, etc. So you have to bear that in mind.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Let me check if there are any more comments. No. All right. Are there any more comments or questions for Dr. Facey just before we end this series? All right. So, yes, scene one, Dr. Facey, or any comment you
No,
have?
no, I'm not seeing any other comment, but yeah,
Mm-hmm.
we would have observed over the years the stellar performance of some of our track and field athletes, and we would have also observed the decline in the performance of other athletes. So, for example, we may not be performing as well in cricket now, but we may not be performing as well in football for the males.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that we must consider in improving athletes' performance is all these variables surrounding the development of an athlete. Uh, the athlete's performance needs to consider all the angles that were mentioned in the first or the second slide of this presentation, right? Physiological, psychological, biomechanical, nutritional, all these variables must be considered. Of course, pharmacological is a method of performance improvement, but of course we know that those methods are illegal, so we don't take that into consideration here. So while this may seem abstract to you, developing countries are using these technologies and these methods to improve their athletes' performance. They're doing very detailed work, and if we don't do anything, then we will eventually be behind.
All
Um,
right. Thank you so much for that comment. And I saw Cornell Lord saying, keep up the good work, Dr. Facey. And I'll just extend that as well and hope that there will be greater marketing and promotion of research that are critical like this one so coaches can, if by extension, get free testing and still increase the body of work that is so well needed. Thank you so much, Dr. Facey. And I want to thank all of the participants who have been here on YouTube with us. And we look forward to you joining us on the next series, which will be announced in due time. So thank you, everybody. And thank you so much, Dr. Facey.
yes,
Thank you,
thank you.
everyone.
Yes, thank you all. Blessings.
Bye.